This is the Alcohol Free Lifestyle Podcast, where you learn to live a life of health, wealth, love, and happiness.
Welcome to the Alcohol Free Lifestyle Podcast. I am Terri Patterson, coach here at Alcohol Free Lifestyle. And today I want to talk about a topic that comes up a lot. And this is the idea of moderation. And so it's fascinating to me to think about moderation because often when we're drinking and over drinking, we think that moderation is the golden ticket. And so today, let's talk about whether moderation is myth or magic. So, first of all, let's define moderation. And moderation is really the idea that we are going to avoid extremes of behavior or expression, and we're going to observe reasonable limits. And so this sounds very reasonable when it comes to monitoring our alcohol intake. And what's really interesting and so pervasive is that as a culture, we have a saying, everything in moderation. You might have heard this before. You might have even said it yourself. So, what does it mean, everything in moderation? Well, I think the message that we're hearing from that statement is that we are capable of moderating everything. And today, we're going to talk about this very important concept of how the brain might impact moderation. And we're going to ask, is it really true that we can moderate everything? So I think it's really powerful to think about these steps that we want to consider when it comes to moderation. So, in order to moderate anything, it requires several steps. We have to be mindful and have some awareness around our substance use. And so, in this case, alcohol. So, first of all, before we can think about moderating, we have to ask, well, how much am I drinking? And what would I consider moderation to be? So, first of all, we really have to have this awareness of what is moderation for me? And it's a very personal journey because moderation for someone might look like drinking once a week. And for someone else, it might look like one drink every 2 days. So, the first place to start is really this idea of awareness. And for many of us, when we are drinking more than we want to, we're really in a place of not knowing what it looks like to cut back. So, for example, if you are somebody who's drinking every night and maybe you're having a half a bottle of wine every night, well, is moderation having one glass of wine? Is it having a half a bottle every other day? So you can see right away that moderation gets a little tricky because, first of all, we have to have some intention around moderation. What does moderation look like for me? And then we also have to consider, is moderation helpful? Because we are going to enter into a very unique journey if we are considering moderation. So, in order to moderate, we're going to have not only awareness, we're also going to have this willpower. We're going to have to be able to stop and start at will. So, moderation when it comes to alcohol requires that, well, if I didn't drink last night, I can drink tonight. Or this isn't a drinking night, even as everybody at the table starts to raise their wine glass as the waiter comes around. And so it requires a lot of forethought and it requires willpower because in a moment, we're going to have to make a split second decision. We also are going to require decision making skills. And if you've ever made a lot of decisions in a single day, you know what it's like to reach the end of your capacity for decision making. And so the idea that we can flip a switch and have more ability to make a decision in the moment is really a falsehood because decision making is a limited resource. the more decisions we make, the less decision making resources we have. And so, if we've been making decisions all throughout the day, and suddenly we are in a situation where we're trying to decide to drink or not to drink, we can see that decision making might run out. So, willpower and decision making are going to be a part of a moderation plan. And we have to be realistic about whether or not that will work for us. And so, one of the things we can explore is kind of playing the tape forward and asking ourselves in a social situation, at home with my partner, is does it feel possible to moderate? And so I think we have to be mindful of all of that. So let's talk for a minute about mindful drinking. So one of the things that's really interesting is when we think about mindfulness, it requires a lot of energy from our brain and a lot of intention. And what's really interesting is that we have to understand the influence of alcohol on decision making. So, what happens is alcohol actually lowers our inhibition and impairs our judgment. And so it makes it harder to stay mindful when we've already started drinking. So, if moderation is your golden ticket, how do you make sure that you only have one drink? Because what happens is one drink changes our brain chemistry and it makes it harder to say no to that second or third drink. And so this is where moderation starts to feel a little bit more like myth. And and we also want to pay attention to, we have a lack of awareness or skill when it comes to mindful drinking techniques. So like we talked about, it requires uh, self awareness and intention setting, and that all important ability to monitor yourself as you drink. And all of these are skills that need practice. So to think that we can moderate in the moment really isn't a skill that we can possess until we've had a lot of practice and we really understand what our own guardrails are, what it looks like when we're in a situation where drinking comes up. And so it's really powerful to think, what is my brain doing when I drink? And therefore, is it possible? So, we're going to talk in a moment about the hijacked brain. But first of all, I want to share something with you that I call booze noise. And this is an example of what it was like for me personally when I was drinking and I was trying to cut back. I was trying that all elusive idea of moderation. And so for me, there was a lot of noise in my head, a lot of racing thoughts, a lot of decision making that had to happen when I was considering whether I could moderate or what the situation was or how to make it through the evening. And so some of my booze noise looked like this. If I drank on the weekend, I would say, great, well, I'll just drink on the weekends. But if I had a craving or an event that came up on a Wednesday, I'd say, well, I took Monday, Tuesday off, so maybe I can drink Wednesday. Well, if I drank Wednesday, I probably shouldn't drink Thursday, but then it's the weekend. So if I drink Friday, and is Sunday considered part of the weekend? If I drink Sunday night, is that still the weekend? If I don't drink Sunday night, does that mean I could drink one night during the week because I only drank 2 nights? And on and on and on. And this became really difficult. And it carried with it a lot of attention on drinking. So, one of the things to really think about when it comes to is moderation possible for me or even desirable for me is that we're going to spend a lot of attention and a lot of brain power thinking about alcohol. Do we really want to do that in our life? When I was considering my options and what it would look like to stop drinking alcohol, I really wanted to quiet down that booze noise. And if you have ever heard of the idea of the red car scenario. It's when someone mentions, "Oh, I just saw a red sports car. I just bought a red sports car." Everywhere you go, you suddenly see a red sports car. And so that's due to a part of our brain that is this reticular activating system. And it is the way that our attention in our brain focuses on one thing. So, just like if someone challenged you to look for all the red cars on the road as you were driving to work, your brain is now activated and paying attention to alcohol. I see alcohol over there. I see a sign for alcohol. I see those people drinking. I see wine in the cupboard. I'm remembering an event where there was drinking. I get an invitation, and the first thing I do is look to see if drinks are included. I'm planning a party. I'm thinking about booze. And so the more we focus on moderation and keeping these really strict rules, the more our brain is going to be focused on alcohol. And where our attention goes, energy flows. So we're actually going to be in this really difficult place of trying to drink less and yet thinking about alcohol even more often. So I think you can start to see that this is a challenge for sure when it comes to trying to moderate. And so, beyond my own personal story about this booze noise, there's also something that I like to think about as the hijacked brain. And this isn't a new concept. Anytime it comes to addiction, we want to understand our very powerful brain and why it is so focused on drinking and over drinking and not drinking, and why it's so challenging to stop at one drink. So you may have had this experience, and I know I did when I was drinking, where I'd already made a decision. So take the decision making fatigue out of it. And I decided to have one drink. And yet, after that one drink, it was incredibly challenging to say no, even though I thought, and my brain thought, that just having one drink would scratch the itch, that I would then be able to say, "Hey, I was social, I relaxed, this felt great." But it's not how alcohol impacts our brain. In fact, when we have one drink, it's very difficult to not have that second drink. And part of it is the way that alcohol impacts our brain or hijacks our brain. And so, one of the things that we know about alcohol and the way it impacts the brain and the chemicals that are released is that alcohol releases those feel good chemicals. It releases dopamine, which has to do with that pleasure pathway. It also releases some endorphins. And so alcohol is both a stimulant and a depressant. So remember, when we have a stimulant, we feel great until the stimulant starts to wear off. And then we have a different sensation. And this is particularly problematic with alcohol because, again, it's both a stimulant and a depressant. So, as we see our body flooded with these feel good chemicals, we also have a brain that is saying, "Hey, this is a lot of stimulation. We need to balance out this unique pleasure that is coming from alcohol." And so, two things happen. The first is that over time, that blood alcohol content starts to drop, and our body releases chemicals to help us balance. So it releases those depressant chemicals. They can be dynorphin, cortisol, and adrenaline. And so we start to feel worse about 20 minutes after that first drink. And because we have been used to drinking more than one drink, after all, that's why we're trying to moderate. So we see our brain go through this little gymnastics this little back and forth. And what's actually happening is our brain is saying, well, remember, anytime you start to feel dropping down, you start to feel that sensation of the alcohol wearing off, your brain says, get another drink. I know how to fix that. Have that second drink, increase that pleasure, and you'll feel better. And so, for about 20 minutes, we are in that state of slight euphoria. And then we are battling those negative chemicals that are making us feel uncomfortable, irritated, annoyed, and it's harder and harder to stick to the rules we've made about only one drink. So, some of the other ways that our brain gets hijacked in this scenario of moderation is that dopamine and the pleasure pain balance. So, Dr. Anna Lemke, who wrote Dopamine Nation and who was the teacher in a recent course I did through the University of Stanford on the psychology of addiction, she describes how addictive substances and behaviors stimulate a surge of dopamine. So, in the case of alcohol, that's what we're seeing. The feel good neurotransmitter then increases this feeling of pleasure. But the brain, again, is seeking that beautiful balance, right? We call it homeostasis. And so it wants to get back into balance. And so in response, it down regulates those dopamine receptors. And it actually creates this pleasure pain balance toward pain or discomfort as the effect of alcohol wears off. So we can see right away that we're battling this sensation to have another drink because we're starting to feel kind of irritated and less than, and we're starting to feel uncomfortable. And after all, many of the reasons we were drinking in the first place was because we were looking for a way to feel more relaxed. So suddenly we have that first drink. 20 minutes later, we're not feeling so relaxed. And so often that idea of moderation or mindful drinking goes out the window. So the brain's reaction to withdrawal is that when the dopamine high subsides, we again are feeling that low. And this can be called, according to Dr. Anna Lemke, this is part of that dopamine deficit. And so this sense of discomfort drives people to seek out more, in this case, alcohol, to escape that low feeling. And this keeps that cycle of addiction going. The other thing that happens in this hijacking of the brain is that we're really numbing the brain's reward circuitry. And so this is a long term effect. So, over time, the excess dopamine stimulation is leading to a desensitized reward system. Again, we're starting to have chemical changes from the effects of alcohol. And so this is part of why it's really challenging. We often think that the conversation about moderation is simply willpower and making rules, and we feel so defeated personally when we can't follow the rules. But this is a great reminder that our brain is really powerful, and there is many chemicals and this balance of pain and pleasure are all at play. And that alone makes it really challenging to switch up our routine of drinking as much as we want to moderating. So, this idea that as we become increasingly dependent on the substance, we are often trying to recreate that. And with enough drinking, we find that we are in fact actually now drinking just to feel normal. And so this is why moderation gets really tricky. What will make me feel normal without putting me into that low state where I want to have another drink? And again, it's not just the decision or the willpower, it's your very powerful brain and the way that alcohol is affecting your brain chemistry. All of this is at play. And so Dr. Anna Lemke goes on to talk about the fact that there's challenges to recovery because This hijacking of the brain and breaking free from addiction involves both a physical and a psychological component. And so she actually recommends not moderating, but instead taking a clean 30-day or more break. And in Project 90, our alcohol free lifestyle flagship program, we actually invite you on a journey of 90 days with no alcohol because we have to break this cycle of tolerance, of pain, pleasure. And in order to do that, a little bit of alcohol is not going to be your friend. In fact, a little bit of alcohol is going to put you right back in that same cycle. And so, according to Dr. Anna Lemke, by taking a complete break and abstaining from alcohol long enough to allow the brain to recalibrate this dopamine balance, that's going to be our best chance at changing our relationship with alcohol and being able to embrace an alcohol free lifestyle. So, I want to talk about one more thing. It's really fascinating to me that when we talk about moderate drinking, we have to ask, well, what does moderate drinking look like for what are the recommended guidelines? How much is considered safe or okay? And so here in the United States, we have a really interesting dynamic. So first of all, the guidelines for the United States of America is that they consider it within normal guidelines is 1 drink a day for women and 2 for men. So that's 7 drinks a week for women and 14 drinks a week for men. But what's fascinating is if you look at the guidelines, what actually happens is 8 drinks a week for women is now considered heavy drinking. So that's just one more drink. So you can see that actually 7 drinks a week is right on the border of heavy drinking. And I remember when I read that the first time, I was confused because I thought, well, why isn't the guideline 3 drinks a week? And then 8 drinks is considered heavy drinking. And so the reality, as many of us know, if you've been caught in this cycle of drinking and over drinking and trying to cut back and failing, many of us know that we don't just drink 1 drink a night as women or 2 drinks as men. In fact, the guidelines for what constitute a drink is small portions. And so a typical glass of wine is somewhere between 6 and 8 ounces. That's a wine glass, right? A restaurant will pour 5, but these guidelines that are telling us how much to drink are actually considering it a 3-ounce pour. So you do the math. 21 ounces. But if we have 6-ounce pours of wine, we're going to reach that in just 3 drinks or 4 drinks. And so that could look like a couple of nights a week. So, how do you moderate? Do you consider the American health guidelines at 1 drink a day? Do you consider what works for you? Do you consider just drinking on the weekends? It's very complicated. And so, this is where moderation as myth or magic is really, really important to consider. And so, I want to invite you into a slightly different scenario. So, we've talked about the challenges of moderation, the the pain pleasure pathway, the way that your brain gets hijacked, the way that we are wired to build a tolerance so that 1 drink feels good, but then we get so uncomfortable, it's really hard to stop. We've also talked about, well, how does your mind make these decisions and how much booze noise is going on in our brain when we're trying to moderate. So I want to imagine instead, if we said that moderation was a myth, what would that look like? Could we slow down that noise Could we actually take a break and see a real difference? Because don't forget, if you're drinking one day and then not drinking for 2 days and then drinking again, your brain and body don't know what it's like to not drink. The impact lasts longer than just a few hours. And so you're never really out of that drinking cycle until you actually abstain for a period of time. And so when it comes to decision making, imagine making a firm decision: no alcohol for 30, 60, 90 days. Does that give you a breath of air? I know it did for me. When I took moderation off the table and instead I decided to stop drinking forever, I decided it would be so much easier for my brain to just focus on one thing. How do I stop drinking? Not about how often or when or why or under what circumstances. I got tired of all that noise. But instead, the freedom of making one decision and then moving forward. Oh, it was like a breath of fresh air. And so I invite you to consider, does that feel freeing to you? Does that feel good? And if you decide that moderation is a myth, then you don't have to be in that constant decision making mode. You don't have to consider, do I have the willpower? Am I strong enough? No, all of that is set aside. And the work that is in front of us, the next step, the path that opens up, is this beautiful opportunity to explore how. How. So once we set aside the why, the when, the what, now we just need to focus on one thing. How can I do this? What tools do I need to develop? How do I find the resources? And so in Alcohol Free Lifestyle, we have programs that help you do exactly that. They help you take a break for a quantified period of time in order to allow your brain to reset, in order to stop using willpower and decision making every day, and actually allow your dopamine levels to reset. So you're no longer in this dopamine deficit that creates cravings and leaves your brain wanting alcohol. Instead, all of that shifts, and we simply focus on the decision to move forward with alcohol not in the picture. So I hope you've enjoyed this segue into, or this journey into considering how our brain might be impacted by something called mindful drinking and moderation. And is moderation myth or magic? I hope you now have a few more ideas about what this looks like for you. And as always, if you're curious to know more, I invite you to check out alcoholfreelifestyle.com and see if a 90-day break is in your future.
Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about our stop drinking services, you can go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com. You can follow me on Instagram at James Swanwick. Our YouTube channel is at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/YouTube, or you can send me an email at james@alcoholfreelifestyle.com.